So, bread. It's one of the easiest things you can do. It's one of the most basic recipes in the kitchen. It consists of 4 ingredients, 5 if you want to get picky, and I think it's just one of the most fun things you can do for one of the most beginner recipes that you can make, really. And for some reason people are scared of it. Some people seem to think that it's really complicated, that you need to get the yeast perfect or you need to get the dough perfect, and it's not the case at all. You need no equipment. You can use a stand mixer if you want to, but all in all you need 4 ingredients, your hands and an oven and a bowl and maybe a spoon. Scales would be nice. Maybe a mixing jug. I'm going to stop now. So, first episode, like I say, it's going to be bread. I'm going to make a nice simple white loaf. All you're going to need is 500 grams of flour, 7 grams of yeast, a little bit of sugar for the yeast to grow because it needs food once you've rehydrated it, a little bit of salt and some olive oil. Super simple, really basic ingredients, and let's get cracking. First thing you need to do is rehydrate the yeast, because most of the time you'll be using dried active yeast. I've spilled that everywhere. And you need to put it in some water with some sugar first to reactivate it. And that's about 7 grams. Pop some 7 grams in about 300 ml of warm water, along with some sugar. Doesn't really matter too much about how much sugar it is, as long as it's, you know, around a tablespoon to a teaspoon-ish. Give this a little bit of a stir, and then in the next 5 minutes or so, that will dissolve quite nicely, and then you can put it into the dry ingredients. Right, so it's been about 5 minutes since the yeast has been reactivated. It's going to get a little bit of foam on the top. You'll see a little bit of foam on the top, a few bubbles that will make you know that it's alive still. If you get dead yeast, it's not going to rise that much. You'll end up with flat bread, pita bread, that kind of thing. So once that's been rising for about 5 minutes, get on to the main part of the bread, which is the flour. So we'll get about 500 grams in here. This normally makes, you know, either 2 small loaves or 1 quite big one, depending on what you want to do. I normally make 2 small ones and then freeze one of them. Now that means I've got fresh bread for quite a while. It's 500. So that's in that. Get your salt, and you want about 5 grams of salt. It's not a massive amount, it's just a little bit, so about a teaspoon. There we go. And then once you've done that, professionalism. Once you've done that, grab the bowl, mix it up a little bit, and then you want to make a little hole in the middle, and that's where your olive oil and the yeast goes. So you put about, I don't know, maybe a tablespoon and a half of olive oil in. Let that sit there. And then the important thing with this is, if you add all of the water and yeast all in one go, everything will clump together, the bottom will be really sticky, and everything at the bottom will stick to the bowl really easily. And that'll just make a nightmare, because everything will stick to the bottom and it'll just make a whole job a lot more complicated. So if you add it a little bit at a time, that kind of thing at a time, and then start pushing the flour into the water, just in little batches. It means you can pull the flour from the bottom of the bowl when it's still dry, and it just makes your job a whole lot easier. So once you've done this 3 or 4 times, you'll have all the water in. I always say to use your hands rather than like a spoon or a mixer or anything, just because it gets it mixed a little bit easier. You can tell how the dough feels, you know how sticky it is, you know how much water it needs, you know how much flour it needs, if it needs extra. It just makes it a lot more intuitive, is the right word. And, you know, who doesn't like getting their hands a little bit dirty when they're cooking? It's not meant to be an exact science. As long as you know what you're doing, which hopefully by the end of this video you will, everything will be fine. Get that foam in there, go on. Right, so after all this is mixed, I'll probably jump cut, because that's what the professionals do. And I'll show you what the dough is meant to look like. Right, so that's roughly what the dough should look like. You've got a nice solid mix. I can't hold the camera that well with one hand. It's a little bit sticky. You're expected to have it a little bit sticky, just because if you have it completely dry, then it'll be way too dry once you've baked it. But it's all in one mess, it's all mixed, and now is to knead it. So I'll pop you back there. The best idea for this, pop this to one side for a second, take a little bit of flour onto the worktop, and then you can use that to add a little bit of flour to the dough if you need it. But the first thing you need to do is to flour the worktop. So get a little bit of that, spread it across, and then that'll stop the dough from sticking to the worktop as much as it has been sticking to my hands, because this is a messy little loaf. So the whole purpose of kneading, in general terms, is to create more gluten bonds within the bread. And that's a good thing, because it helps it rise a little bit, it helps it give it shape, and it generally makes for a tastier, slightly chewier loaf. The more that you knead it, the more you will get gluten development, and that will mean a slightly thicker, chewier taste. So if you prefer your bread to be more like pizza dough, then you knead it for a little bit longer. If you prefer it to be light and fluffy and like you're chewing on a cloud, then knead it for a little bit less. But the basic principle is knock it around a little bit. Kneading is dead easy, literally just stretch it, fold it in on itself, and then use the palm of your hand to bring it in on itself, and just keep doing this. You're essentially doing a manual version of a stand mixer, because all the stand mixer does is knock it around with all of the beaters until it develops the gluten a little bit better. So ideally you'll do this for about 10 minutes. I'm not going to show you 10 minutes of me doing this because it's a little bit boring, but by the end of it I'll show you the stretchiness and the solidness of dough before we put it into rise for an hour. Little tip, this isn't necessary, but it's a really useful tool if your dough is a little bit too sticky or your hands are a little bit too dry. It can be useful for scraping the worktop. Bring it in, scrape it underneath, and then if your dough's stuck to the worktop, you can just get it off really quickly. I think they're less than £10 on Amazon. Not necessary if you don't want to spend more money on it, but if you do, then it's a super useful tool. Right, so it's been about 10 minutes. I did this step before I turned the camera back on, but one of the best ways to tell if you've done enough kneading is called the window pane test. I'll move a little bit closer so hopefully you can see it. Basically, you want to be able to stretch the dough and see that it gets so thin without tearing that you start to see through it. Hopefully you can see that this dough is really thin, you'll be able to see your finger through it. And this, in general, hopefully you can see all of the light through it, means that it's starting to get perfect. It does tear a little bit because, you know, there is the rest of the dough on the bottom, but you can see there that it's nice and stretched and you can see through it just a little bit. So, put that back into a little bowl there. Next thing to do is just let it rise. So you get your bowl, you can put a little bit of oil in it. I'm going to put a little bit of olive oil in it just to make it not stick to the bottom, because letting it stick to the bottom is one of the most annoying things in the world. I'm not even exaggerating. So put a little bit of olive oil in the bottom. Pop that right in there. Pop this here, and then all I'm going to do is put some cling film over the top, wrap it nice and tight, and then find a really nice warm spot in the sun where it can rise for an hour or so, and then you'll see it after it's doubled. Right, so we've had it proofing for just over an hour. You can see that it's got quite a few bubbles in it. You can see that it's risen by, it's about doubled. It's a little bit less than double maybe, but it's still quite nice and light. You can see if you press it into it, it bounces up quite nicely. And by all of these points you can see that it's about ready. So all you need to do now is to shape it into the shape you want and then let it proof a second time. The easiest way would be to have like a sandwich loaf or like a loaf tin, but if you don't have one of those, if you just have a sheet, you can form it into a little ball, you can form it into a rectangle, any kind of shape you want to, and it will proof quite nicely. So what I need to do now is gently take this out. We'll knock a couple of bubbles out just to make it a little bit easier to form. Get it all into a nice round shape. Should be nice and easy. I'm sure you all know what circles look like. Fold it in on itself a couple of times just to make it a little bit easier to form. And all you're going to do is take it in both hands like this and do this circular motion, tucking in the outside into the bottom. After a few goes at this, it should be nice and easy because it's not so sticky now. You should get a nice little ball like this. Might take a few attempts just to get it more round, but after that you should get a nice little ball like that and be able to plonk it onto your dish like this. Now what we're going to do after this is leave it to proof a second time. It'll take about an hour again. We're also going to put the oven onto about 240 degrees centigrade for the hour that it takes for the bread to proof. Obviously ovens normally heat up a lot quicker than that, but for the bread we need to make it absolutely sure that all of the oven is a uniform temperature and it's definitely up to the right temperature, because if you have, say, a bad oven or you have one that isn't fan assisted, it can lead to pockets of air that are colder than the rest of the oven, and it can lead to uneven bakes and a little little bit less quality bread, but yeah, if you can't help it, then what are you to do? Right, so it's been proofing again. You can see it's almost doubled in size again, which is pretty good. It's quite wide, but it will rise hopefully a little bit instead of just going out sideways. But yeah, the last thing to do now is just put it in the oven. It's been preheating for about an hour, about the same amount of time as the bread has been proofing. Knock it down to about 220 for the actual bake. Two of the things that I've found really useful is a water sprayer and some ice. The water sprayer is more optional, but the ice we're going to throw into the bottom of the oven along with the bread when we put the bread in the oven. And what that does, it creates quite a lot of steam for the outside of the bread to not harden up so quickly, so then it can rise a little bit faster, and create this really nice soft pillowy bread instead of getting a really hard crust so quick. The water does the same thing. You spray it on the top of the bread and on the inside of the oven, and that helps create a more steamed environment for the oven, so it helps the bread rise a little bit more. So yeah, that's all that, and hopefully you'll see it in about 20-25 minutes when it's ready. Maybe a little bit less because this is a little bit thin, but it should be fine. Right, so the bread's had about 25 minutes in the oven. It looks perfect. It was risen quite well. It didn't really go out as much as I was fearing. It rose quite nicely. It's got a brilliant piece of colour to it. It's nice and brown there. One of the things that you can check to see if it's done is I can't remember what it's called anymore, but there's a test you can do to make sure it's done. And it's essentially you grab the bottom, give it a bit of a tap, and it's meant to sound hollow. It's meant to sound like you're knocking on a door. So if you hear that, and it sounds hollow, it's done. One of the other things you can do is poke a cocktail stick into it, or any kind of thin needle like a kebab skewer or anything like that. And if it comes out clean, if there's no dough or anything that comes out like that, then it's also done. But really, all there is to it now, put it on a wire rack to cool. You want to have something with holes underneath so you can get the air circulating underneath it, and then let it cool completely before you cut into it. If you cut into it when it's warm, it will make the structure in the bread collapse a little bit because it's still hot, there's still a lot of steam in there. So if you let it cool down completely, you'll still get those really nice air bubbles and pockets in the bread. Yeah, that's basically it. Bread is really simple. It takes a little bit of time, it takes an hour to proof, takes another hour to proof again. But once you get a hang of it, once you know how to figure out what's wrong with the dough, if there is anything wrong with the dough, once you know, does it need more water, does it need more flour, once you've realised what it's meant to look like, how it's meant to look in the oven, completely simple, you'll be able to get consistent results every single time. I haven't got a way to end these, so zoop.